Professional liability insurance that provides coverage for violation of subchapter G of Chapter 1102. The amendments were published in the August 25th issue. The Texas Real Estate Inspector Committee previously recommended the Commission propose these amendments to clarify the minimum standards of financial liability that an inspector must maintain during the period an inspector is licensed. The legislature has enacted 1102.1141 of the Texas Occupations Code, which requires an inspector to maintain a minimum of $100,000 financial responsibility in the form of an insurance policy, bond, or other security. Commission. This is to provide for professional liability coverage to protect the public against a violation of subchapter G of Chapter 1102. The Texas Real Estate Inspector Committee has received several questions and comments on the proposed amendments and has requested staff to gather additional information before the committee makes a recommendation to the Commission. For this reason, the committee is requesting that the Commission table the proposed amendments until its next meeting in February of 2018. And that is staff's recommendation, that the committee table the proposed amendment February 2018 Commission meeting to allow further vetting of additional information by the Texas Real Estate Inspectors Committee.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
If I may make a suggestion. So we're requiring our inspectors, which we already do, to hold liability insurance with a minimum coverage of $100,000.
Statutory, yeah.
Correct. And this rule would clarify that they're required to hold a policy that does not contain any kind of eroding policy limits, which are provisions in insurance contracts that reduce your coverage available by any attorney's fees that are incurred in defending an inspector. And that makes sense, but I have the same question, and I'm glad we're tabling this, because what I would like to see us do is a couple of things. One is I'd like to see some kind of market survey to see what this would do to premiums. How much does it cost to go buy a policy that doesn't have eroding limits versus a $100,000 policy that does? Also, how much would it cost to buy a $300,000 policy instead of a $100,000 policy, even though that $300,000 policy might have eroding coverage? So if it's going to be more cost effective for our inspectors, paradoxically, to increase their coverage requirement but allow them to purchase insurance that does have eroding limits, then that would make more sense to me than prohibiting them from purchasing or saying that coverage that does have eroding limits doesn't fit this.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm going to let Mr. Slagle speak to this, since he's the liaison to that committee.
Well, and certainly he can answer that, but I was in the meeting virtually, and that is the reason that they're asking for us to table this, because they ask for this search. But I think you being on the record for it is good.
And the only thing I'll say lastly is that it, unfortunately for our inspector members, that policies that don't have eroding limits are better for consumers. Right. So that's a matter of fact. But Mr. Schlegel.
Commissioner Turner, we're gather some information, the very information you're talking about, trying to get some idea of what the costs would be to the inspector community, the availability of the product out there. Those issues, you're absolutely right in terms of the higher limits. Obviously the issue is that by statute we're 100,000, so we can't require an inspector to go higher than that. The intent of the language that was proposed, I think, was to allow for inspectors to do that. That's why I think it says that it reduces the minimum coverage required. So that was the intent. It may not be as artfully drafted to do that, but the intent was to allow for, if they go above a certain limit, to allow them to have some leeway in terms of those types of clauses. But one of the issues is that the statutory language says that it's there for the to cover the protection. I have it here, but it's consumer. It's to cover. To protect the consumer against violations of subchapter G. So the sticky problem is any clause that erodes that $100,000 and actually pays for the benefit of the inspector through their duty to defend, there's an apparent violation in the statute.
I completely understand. I just agree with them that we should do a little study to see what the financial impact is on it.
I apologize if I gave too much information. I just wanted to let everyone know that that's sort of what the issue is here. So we are gathering information. I'm to several agents just last week and got some information, and we're continuing to do that. So thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and put a motion on the table, and then I will bring the speakers up. So, Commissioner Williams.
Move that the commission table, the proposed amendments until February 2018 commission meeting.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay. Are you Michael Rucker or Don Nixon? Don Nixon, okay.
Yes, I'm Don Nixon with Southern Preferred MGA. We write a lot of home inspectors and are the largest producer of home inspectors in the state. I think you all probably have my public comment in your material there. And
please remind us of your comment, if you will. Yeah, so we have it fresh. Please remind us of your comment.
Yes, ma'am. In my public comment, I stated that I kind of gave you some boring background on why those policies are written the way they are. And presently, there is no professional liability that I can find that's not written on a claims-made form with defense costs within the limits. And Mr. Turner here made an excellent point a while ago. If you elect, and I know this is going to come up again, it's being tabled today, it's going to come up again. If you mandate a policy that has defense cost outside the limits, then you are mandating a policy that presently does not exist. And it's going to cause a lot of turmoil in the market. I spoke with Mr. Slagle about this earlier. He's talked to an agent who talked to the companies. Yes, they could do it, and it might be this much money, whatever. I recently traveled to Atlanta, Georgia for the Professional Liability Underwriting Society meetings. I met with all of the syndicates at Lloyd's that back us. We are a cover holder at Lloyd's of London, and none of them liked it. And they all said, yes, in theory it's possible. We don't know how much it will cost. I can tell you today, based on what Mr. Turner said, I can tell you how much $300,000 of coverage costs with an eroding limit or with defense costs within the limit. I can tell you, we have rates for that. We offer up to $1 million, $2 million in coverage, and we have some very prestigious inspectors in Texas who carry those limits. The lion's share of inspectors carry the minimum $100,000 per claim, $100,000 aggregate limit coverage because they're small business people, and that's what meets their needs. We have never had a claim go over $100,000. The biggest claims that we have had, and I think we had one reach about $85,000, and of that $85,000, about $60,000 or 65,000 was in defense costs, and the rest of it we finally threw in a nominal. The inspector really didn't err. We finally threw in some money to help the plaintiff finance their case against the seller who had, in all fairness, committed serious fraud. But anyway, I know this is going to come up again. I felt it was important enough that even though I had knee replacement just a few weeks ago, I wanted to come and just let you know, if you elect to go with we require $100,000 with costs outside the limits, you are mandating a policy that presently does not exist. I polled every company that writes in Texas. Like I said, we're the largest. You have Hartford and you have Hanover, which are admitted companies. You have Ace Westchester, you have AmTrust, you have us underwriters at Lloyd's of London, all of us surplus lines, all of us write virtually the same policy. So I'd really appreciate your time. I appreciate you letting me speak. I felt it was important enough. I know that y'all can't know everything about everything, but I hope you will read my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon. Thank
for
you.
your time.
I do have a question, sir. Sir,
Mr. Nixon,
Yes.
if those limits were to be imposed at the rate that they would go, have you heard comments from inspectors? Because most of us practice real estate, but not inspections. We don't really know what happens. What I anticipate is that people will just leave the field because they would not be able to make it between Obamacare and the insurance. What are the comments you're listening to?
I think that there is some validity to your point, Ms. Stevens. We have had an extraordinary number of inspectors, retire, leave the business or whatever, unless there has been a lot of turnover in the inspector business. We have schools putting new inspectors out, Champions and others putting new inspectors out every year, and yet the number seems it's gone up a little bit over the last few years, but it seems to have been fairly static. At the low point, there was about 2,300 something licensed inspectors. I think now the number 9 years later is up to about 2,700, but there is a good bit of turnover, both from normal things, retirement, age and whatever, and there's just a lot of guys that just don't make it. They spend the money, they go to school and buy the insurance and everything that's required, and they don't make it and they have to go do something else. But any cost that you add to the small business guy is going to hurt. Presently, the policy that we write runs about $900 a year, more or less. If we could get our underwriters to agree to the policy that y'all were talking about with the staying with 100,000, but with defense costs outside the limits, we estimated, my estimate, what it was going to run it up about 30 to 40%. I think Mr. Slagle usually was 25 to 40%. The agent that you talked to said that if they would write it, so you would be taking, let's say, you'd be taking a $900 policy and turning it into about $1,200, and so
60. Yeah.
it could make the difference. You don't know.
Mr. Nixon?
Yes.
In your public comment, you anecdotally mentioned that you've never had a claim against an inspector in your practice exceed $100,000.
That's correct.
Is there a way for us to survey other insurers, or for us to gather that data in order? I know some of it may be confidential because of parameters of settlement agreements that are entered into in this litigation. But what I'd like to figure out is whether or not we're a solution looking for a problem here. Because if so, then we don't need to make this change. In fact, we may need to do the opposite and say that.
Right.
That if you have $100,000 limits, that's fine, regardless of whether or not it's an eroding policy.
I have agreed. I'm going to provide our data to Mr.
Okay.
in order to help, and I'm going to provide it by the real claims paid and defense paid. We spend, I can tell you, there's facts of the facts. We spend 2 to 3 times each year on defense costs what we spend on actual claims. There are a lot of claims made against home inspectors for which they're not liable.
Sure.
Things that are underground, things that are behind closed walls, things that have been hidden by, and what happens in a lot of cases, our first notice of a claim, the home inspector's first notice of a claim is process server knocks on his doors and hands him suit papers. Well, you get to reading the seller got sued, both agents get sued, and the home inspector, everybody gets sued at once, and then we'll find out who's what. And a lot of times we end up contributing some nominal amount after spending a good defense just to get the home inspector out of the box.
Seems to me if you're the rare consumer who has an issue in which one of these policies, being an eroding policy, would matter,
Right.
You're probably going to be SOL, pardon my language, if it's going to be well over $100,000.
Right, and the reality is when you think about it, and things can happen. There's just not a whole lot the E&O portion, the professional liability portion of the home inspector's policy really is something down the road they find, and I suppose in theory they could find a 100,000, but typically the claim that a home inspector is really seriously liable for is going to be in the 10 to 15 to 20,000. One down in Houston recently, and legitimate claims, we pay them as fast as we can because they don't get any cheaper. And we had a claim in Kingwood, Texas, fairly recently, where the inspector, a reasonably new inspector, missed. There was an issue with some windows. There was, and you know, they said we owed it. I paid it. I can't tell you everything about it. We use independent adjusters. We use our attorneys and whatever, but it had to do with the height of the windows. The code had changed, and there wasn't safety glazing in some of the windows. It was a deal. It was an $18,000 claim, which is, you know, is a fairly substantial claim. We paid it real fast. They said we owed it. The adjuster I sent out said, hey, here's what it's supposed to be, and here's what it is, and these windows aren't high enough, I guess, for people to safely egress from the home, and they're supposed to be this, and this door is supposed to have safety glazing in it, and whatever it was. And that's a typical claim. Or a roof. You know, we had one just last week I paid.
Okay, let's wrap it up. Let's kind of wrap it up.
Any of that kind of stuff, and that's a typical legitimate home inspector claim. Your odds of having a $100,000 miss are fairly small.
Tony, will you see if you can find some information on that too? Typical size of claims in inspector cases.
Right. The biggest.
The typical. Will you see if you can find some information too, in addition to what Mr. Nixon's going to provide? Hang on, Mr. Nixon.
Y'all can get together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Nixon.
Give you the list of companies.
Give them to Mr. Slagle. Great. Thank you.
Thank y'all for your time.
Take care of your knee. Wait a minute, Curie. We also had a Michael Rucker down for this item. Is Mr. Rucker still in the room? Mr. Rucker gave us up. Okay. Where are we? We need to vote on the table, right?
Have a motion. We need to vote.
We need to vote on the table. All in favor of tabling this, say aye.
Aye.
And opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes have it. So now we're 26B.
The good news is